Hey there.
Hi,
We are
the
the
Dyslexia Duo.
Each week, we sit down with amazing people, including top researchers and experts in dyslexia, powerful advocates, affected individuals, and more.
Together, we break down the myths, share real stories, highlight research and strategies to advise our listeners about this prevalent learning disability.
Come join us. Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Aimee.
So we have a brand spanking new guest. Sometimes we have some people that like to come back and come talk to us, but this is a new guest to our podcast. So will you go ahead and introduce yourself to us?
Hi, Aimee and Melissa. My name is Elizabeth Norton, and I am a tenured associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And I study what helps kids learn to read and what makes learning to read hard for some kids, especially based on their brains, and how to identify those things as early as possible. And then if you look at my lab website, we all talk about something that we like to do that's not just our science. And so things that I really enjoy outside of science are the Red Sox and vintage watches and live music and really old vintage sewing technique called English paper piecing. So those are some of the things that I like to do outside of the lab that help me engage with science and advocacy and things like that and give me the energy to do all of that.
I love all that. My goodness, you threw out that last one. I'm sitting there, I've never heard of that last one before.
I'll tell you all about it if you'd like.
Yeah, maybe we can save it for after the podcast, but that's pretty interesting. Well, very nice, very nice. So what kind of jump started you into studying dyslexia and reading development in students?
My mom was an early education teacher. And so I grew up going to the preschool where she was leading, the classroom next door. And so I think I shared her curiosity in what can we do to help nurture all kids as they're developing. And so I was just a voracious devourer of reading and books and stories when I was a kid. And so depending on my parents' schedules, I would often have my dad read me 5 books before I went to bed, and then he would go to sleep. My mom would be wrapping things up, and I would have her read me 5 more books before I went to sleep. And so I just loved reading and stories and became so interested in this very, very early on. And so I showed up to kindergarten already knowing how to read. It came very easily to me. And I remember in kindergarten, I grew up in very rural New Hampshire. And when I would go to the local library, the usual policy was that someone could take out 2 books at a time.
Right.
And for me, it was so rural that I would have read those 2 books before we were out of the parking lot, basically. And this did not help my mom keep me entertained for the week. And so the library created a little role for me where I could carry as many books as I could hold sort of in my arms all the way up to my chin. And they would let me take home all of those books. And so I was reading those books just as quickly and as excitedly as I could. And when I got to first grade, I remember that there were other students who were sitting at different tables, all kind of grouped together. And a lot of them were reading books that seemed really not exciting to me. They had really repetitious text. They didn't have a lot going on. And I thought, like, gosh, why aren't you reading, My Father's Dragon or something much cooler like me? And I had this curiosity about, gosh, like maybe reading is hard for them all the way back then. So yes, this was a spark that I had many years later that I realized this. And then fast forward to when I was in college, I took a course on language acquisition very early in college and got interested in this idea that we could apply science to studying the differences in how kids develop language and reading, and worked in research all 4 years in college and became more and more interested in this, started studying the brain bases of reading, in that case in kids who are bilingual and learning to read in one language first versus another versus learning at both languages at the same time. And was pretty sure I wanted to study language and reading in the brain for the rest of my life and thought it would be a good idea to take a break from research. And so I was a teacher at Landmark School which is
Oh,
a
yeah.
private school for
Mhm.
students with language-based learning disabilities. And so I taught high school biology and chemistry.
Oh, wow.
And I also taught one-on-one language tutorials. So I had 2 students that I saw every day of the week for 40 minutes or so to support their reading and language. And early then, I realized that I wanted to get back to the research side. And so when I applied to PhD programs and got into one, I went to the head of the school and I was so nervous to tell him that I was going to be leaving to go to my PhD. And went in and I'd never quit a job before. And it felt like, and I said, I'm going to go into my PhD and try to understand the earliest precursors of reading difficulties. And the head of the school very kindly said, all right, Miss Norton, go put us out of business.
Oh,
Meaning
That's
that
awesome.
Yes, meaning that we all share the goal of hoping that students get early and effective support so that they don't need such intensive support as a specialized curriculum in high school. So
Right.
since then, I have been working on studying reading and language and their brain basis and all of any things that go along with them to try really in that effort still to understand how we can identify students as early as possible so that they can get the best intervention when their brains are going to best benefit from it.
Yeah.
When you were telling your story about being a little kid at the library and carrying out as many, I saw this sign because, I have to be visual. Everybody else checks out too, except for, I don't know what your name, if it was still Norton back then, except for
Yeah,
Elizabeth Norton, as many as she can carry.
pretty much.
You're the exception sign. That's what I kind of saw with that.
Well, I was thinking about this movie called Short Circuit from the 80s, and it was about this robot that had feelings. He was programmed to just be a robot, but he actually had a short circuit and he had feelings and he loved input. He just wanted to read everything he could get his hands on. So I had this visual of you being like this robot, just reading everything you could and learning everything you could. And it made me think how incredible that you are kind of the opposite of the people that you're now trying to, help. And I wonder how you could, thinking back, even being a kid, recognizing that those kids are different, how would you define, obviously you don't have dyslexia, how would you define dyslexia now?
This is a great question. And in a lot of ways, I don't see as many differences. I see a lot of parallels between a kid like me who loved stories and loved reading and really just the idea of getting into being able to read independently was so exciting for me. And I think a lot of kids share that. And also a lot of those experiences I was talking about, hanging out with your caregiver and really sharing those opportunities. And even though my mom was an early childhood teacher, my dad didn't know anything about any of this, and yet we had all of these conversations about what happened in books. And I think that is something that is so amazing for all kids to share with their caregivers. And so I don't see myself as that different in a lot of ways, but then we do show up to the point of learning to read, and some kids find it a lot easier and some kids find it a lot harder than others. And so in terms of the definition of dyslexia, we have the new-ish IDA definition that I was just preparing to teach a class on tomorrow to some undergraduates at Northwestern. One of the things importantly that I took away from my time as a teacher is that every student is so different. And to have a category that we call dyslexia, we need because we need to be able to decide which students get certain kinds of help and things like that. But the similarities are smaller than the differences in a lot of ways. And so when I very quickly talk about the definition of dyslexia to other people, I say an unexpected difficulty with learning to read. So everything else seems to be in place. Spoken language is okay, vision, hearing, opportunities to learn to read are all there, but something that we can't quite put our finger on easily is not working well, such that learning to read has become difficult.
So I would love to hear your takeaways about the new definition. We were at IDA when they did the announcement. It was like a big brouhaha, going on. I mean, it was met with applause, right? Because it is the International Dyslexia Association across different languages. Dyslexia is going to present itself in a different way. But I would love to hear just a little tidbit of what you're going to tell your class tomorrow.
I think there are a lot of good things in this definition. And one of the things that if you just look at, I was changing my slide from the last time that I taught this, and the definition is longer and more nuanced than it used to be. And in some ways, I think that reflects a lot of the research that's gone on in the, I think 12 plus years since maybe even longer. Gosh, I'm trying to
I
remember
think
when
it's
the previous
longer. Isn't it like
20.
longer,
2001?
20,
Yeah.
gosh, okay, even longer. So we've done a heck of a lot of research since then. And I think we've started to realize more and more that there are all of these different processes that are playing into reading ability. And so one that I can think of is, I believe the old definition put the phonological component of language sort of front and center and said, and maybe also other things. And I think that is more evened out in the newer definition, that there are multifactorial factors that are affecting reading ability. I think it's interesting that neurobiology is still there, but it's not at the front in the way that it used to be, because we know there are neurobiological and genetic components, but it's not just A or B, it's there or it's not a thing. And I think some of the things that this definition incorporates that I'm excited about are the more clear description of how language abilities and reading abilities overlap. And then also two things that I've been studying and that I think we have more work to do on to really help students succeed is they mention psychological well-being, which I think of as mental health. And so I've been really interested in studying kids with dyslexia and their mental health, and sort of what are the shared vulnerabilities and what is the chicken and the egg in some ways. I think there are some probably things that are maybe going on before kids learn to read, but also some cascading things as they're struggling with learning to read. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And then lastly, I really like the end of the definition because I've been so interested in looking at early indicators. It really mentions that early identification can be a big benefit. And I think especially for policy, and having tried to work in policy a little bit in a couple of states, everyone sort of decides that this is a good idea, but it's very hard to see it play out in practice.
Why do you think that is?
I think that what I've learned is that policy is really complex. And as scientists, we don't get training in how to translate what we do as scientists to policy. And there are a lot of competing different things that any policymaker is doing. And even for all of us in the community of people who study and care about and want to learn about dyslexia, getting on the same page and understanding all of the complexities is tough. And to get somebody who's brand new and doesn't know anything about this to understand is even tougher in a lot of ways. And then it's very hard not only to know exactly what we want to do, but be able to set up ways that make doing it feasible. So for example, in my experience, having been in Illinois for about 10 years now, there's a law on the books that says that schools need to screen students for dyslexia, for reading problems. And that's good. That's a really important first step. But then following that, in my experience, there aren't any negative consequences if schools don't do that.
Right.
And there's no guidance about how to do it well. And so other states, for example, do a better job of this. Before this, I was in Massachusetts, and I've stayed connected with a number of folks in Massachusetts from Decoding Dyslexia and other groups that really were engaged in that policy change. And they have very science-based, descriptive, clear guidelines about what are the types of measures that need to be used. And when you're going to choose a measure for a given construct like phonological awareness, what do we need to know about how good that particular measure is? And so it's hard to get that level of nuance into the law in every state.
Okay, because what I was thinking about when you were talking, and I took a couple of notes, and I know I'm going to come to my notes later and go, what is this gibberish I wrote down? But it's so I don't forget while we're talking. Do you think this broader definition is going to make dyslexia identification more difficult for our students with possible dyslexia?
That's a really good question, Aimee. I think it depends on a lot of different things. I don't think this definition fundamentally changes the way that I think about dyslexia, right? Still in this, if we boil it down, unexpected difficulty learning to read. I don't know how much in my experience too, and this might be because of different interpretations of the national laws like IDEA and state laws and things like that. To me, there's still so much lack of clarity for teachers, school professionals, families about what it means to get a diagnosis of dyslexia. Do you need to go to a medical diagnostic, or can this be done by your school? And how does that relate to terms that are not dyslexia, like specific learning disability and reading? I sort of see the landscape as already so complex that I'm not sure that this definition, which is not a sea change from the previous definition, but I think gives some more nuance and information, I don't see it as negatively potentially impacting the number of kids who need that support being diagnosed, but it's another thing to get this information out to all of the people who need to know it. And so when something like this changes, even a moderate amount, it takes a lot of work to get that information out to everybody who needs to know to be able to make the most updated and accurate diagnosis.
And I totally connect with you saying about, because not all, but a lot of states now have screener guidelines. You should administer a screener at this grade and at this grade and at this grade. And then it comes up and it flags. Now we're in Texas, so we have a pretty good idea of what comes next. Not always, but most of the time. But other states are like, well, came up as they could be at risk for dyslexia. Now what? They don't really follow through with what to do next.
I think the now what is a question from almost everyone that I encounter. I think for so many kids, especially as this definition, in my mind, gets a little bit more comprehensive. And a lot of my training is from going past the single phonological deficit view of dyslexia. So I did my PhD with Marianne Wolf, who I know you two have had on the podcast multiple times, and really have been brought up in the idea that it was one thing to get one clear targetable cause of dyslexia on the books and all of the research that says that a phonological awareness deficit can cause reading problems stands up. We know that's the case, but in her double deficit hypothesis in 1999, Marianne and her colleague Pat Bowers put out there that a deficit in the things that support rapid automatized naming, or RAN, and phonological awareness, either of those could cause reading deficits like dyslexia. And then also we need to think about the kids that have both, and that those kids are likely to be the kids who have the hardest time with learning to read. And one of the things that I think Marianne has said for the whole time since this has been out more than 25 years now is that was a first stepping stone to getting the field and the world to think of dyslexia as something that doesn't have one single root cause, but so many multifactorial things going on all at once. And so with that idea, I think getting screening laws on the books is trickier too, because we need to have the science that tells us not just what do you screen with, but then if you have a kid, like you exactly said, Aimee, with screens needing more support or needing further evaluation, what do we do? That is one of the hardest questions out there right now. And honestly, I was really excited. I have a colleague in my department, Megan Roberts, who's an amazing clinical trial scientist, and she and I were talking about writing a grant to the U.S. Institute of Educational Sciences, IES, to try to do this work to say, okay, based on this kid's screening profile, if we give this type of intervention, what works? And now that grant mechanism for work through IES has been dissolved. And so I think I worry about how we're going to be able as a field to do that work going forward, because IES was such an important funder of a lot of work on reading, and especially on reading intervention, which is some of the hardest research to do practically and probably the most important. And so I really wonder about and worry about that question of what now, when we know that a kid has screened in a way that looks like they're going to be likely to struggle with reading going forward.
Wow.
I think my thought would be, if somebody is showing signs of dyslexia. The screener comes back as they definitely have the signs of dyslexia. And if people really knew what the brain needed to do to learn how to read, would that help move the needle? Would that help kind of get people going, start the engine? Do you think more people just need to know how the brain needs to learn how to read when we're dealing with kids who have signs of dyslexia?
Yes, the more everybody knows, the better. And I think within that, one of the most important things is knowing that at this early age, the brain is as plastic or as flexible and malleable and able to learn as it's going to get. If you think of something like learning a second language, how much harder it is for us as high schoolers or adults or things like that. And we know reading and language are not the same in that way, but it is true for any type of learning that we're doing that early on, our brains are going to be the most able and ready to learn. And then relating back to this mental health piece too, the smaller the gap that students have to close and the fewer experiences they have feeling like reading isn't something they're good at, that they're behind their classmates, that maybe school isn't something that they're going to be good at, the more that we can minimize those experiences is really important. So in terms of people knowing about what the brain needs to learn to read, I think that's really important. And I think a key part of that is recognizing how many parts of the brain are engaged in reading, how they all need to be working together, none of them in isolation, as many of the smart folks who you've had on the podcast before have talked about. And then I think too, with the result from a screener, the next question for me, even if we don't have the perfect answer for what now, is to say, let's look at that profile. What's in the range? What are relative strengths to consider that we might be able to leverage? I think a lot about, because I study rapid automatized naming or RAN, those kids who are low on RAN. And I think when I talk with teachers, that's often one of the biggest questions. What do I do for this kid who they've got pretty good phonological awareness, their language skills are in a typical range. We're not really seeing those as areas immediately to address, but their RAN is really though, how do I fix their RAN? What we know is there's not a way to fix RAN.
Yeah.
And what I really worry about is those kids kind of making it through with their phonological and their decoding and their language skills through first grade and maybe second grade. But when they get to automatizing and needing all of those earlier, lower level processes to be automatic so that they can turn their attention to fluency and comprehension and leveraging their syntactic skills for reading complex sentences and things like that, it's almost like they sort of sneak through the cracks and look like they're doing well until a certain point when they really then start falling behind and teachers are like, oh, I'm not worried about that kiddo sitting in the right side of the classroom over there. They've got this. And then all of a sudden they don't. And so I think understanding just the complexity of everything that's going on, the need to integrate all of these systems and to look at the individual profiles to try to, maybe it's not everything that we can intervene on. I've heard you also talk about working memory, which is so interesting. It's another area that is wildly challenging to try to change. And so the question becomes more, how do we create intervention systems? How do we support all of the other aspects of that child's reading network so that they can be best positioned as they move forward?
Interesting. So you had said RAN is not fixable, right? That's what I wrote down. I don't know if you said those exact words, but that's what I wrote down. And I've seen a lot of people who think you can.
So here's what I know from the science about this. So we know that RAN represents, in a way, our brain's ability to automatize, to be automatic. And I use the analogy of thinking about riding a bike. When you first had to learn to ride a bike, you had to think about where your feet were on the pedals and where your balance was left to right and where your handlebars were steering. And as you got more and more experienced, you don't have to think about those things. You can look at the view. You can look at the view of Lake Michigan as you're biking up to your office on the right, or things like that. And the ability to automatize for reading is so crucial to reading becoming second nature, effortless, something that we can do so easily that we're allowed to have time and space in our brains to think about our background knowledge, to preview what we think the author is going to do next, to devour those complex ideas, all of these kinds of things. And so if RAN reflects this ability to automatize in the brain, the science that I know tells us a couple of things. That this is probably reflected by some white matter pathways in the brain, which in some ways in these classical studies of like if you teach someone to juggle, their white matter pathways change. So in some ways we think, oh, white matter pathways, those are easier to change. But because it's not just one pathway and it's linking all of these pathways across the brain, when we have seen studies that have had kids do RAN over and over, so the same grid naming the same, types of letters, say, for minutes a day, for hours a week, for weeks over and over, they don't get better at reading. They might get a touch faster at RAN, but it doesn't make them better readers. And so I tend to think of both working memory and RAN as things that are somewhat intrinsic to the way that an individual's brain is set up. And I don't like to be sort of deterministic about this. If you're in this boat, you're in a spot that you're not ever going to be able to achieve what you want to achieve.
Yeah, you're like destined to sink.
Right. It's not that at all. I think it's that you're going to need different kinds of support to get to the endpoint that you want to be at. So things like working memory and RAN, I think the evidence has been very weak. That is the thing we should target, as opposed to there are other areas we know, like phonological awareness, decoding, or we have extremely evidence-based clear interventions that they work. And if that's the child's area of weakness, that's where we should be putting our time and resources. But if it's a weakness in working memory or a weakness in RAN reflecting these different underlying processes about automaticity, I think that our energy is best put toward recognizing that's going to be something that is going to be a little bit tougher for that child. And we're going to work our best to strengthen all of the other areas to bring things up and get them to where they want to be.
If you had a double deficit student with the RAN and phonological awareness, and you remediate the phonological awareness, because that's a lot easier to remediate, and you are wanting to try to get them up with their rapid automatic naming, but you're really not able to, as you're expressing. I have several students who have these types of scenarios. Are you feeling like if they can read sufficiently, if they can comprehend sufficiently, if their fluency will never get to over 100 words a minute on their grade level passage, are you feeling like that's still okay, that they're remediated enough to be readers? Or what are your thoughts on that?
This is a really good question. And this brings up some of the experiences I had being a high school teacher at Landmark. So there had been students who had been at Landmark since second grade. They were identified as early as, especially 20 plus years ago, as the norm. And they had been getting high quality instruction day after day for year after year. And learning to read was still extremely difficult for them. They used to call these kids treatment resistors. And I think that's such an awful term, right? It makes it seem like they're fighting it every day. And then that's not the case. There are kids who, no matter what we do, learn to read is going to be harder than for others. And I remember I was also a dorm parent when I was there. So I lived in a dorm with 18 high school girls. And one of these gals, she had been at Landmark since second grade. She was working her hardest every single day to be the best reader that she could. And I remember when she was at the beginning of her senior year, they took a trip to the water park and she was trying to read the menu to get what she wanted at lunch. And they were kind of saying, that's the level now for this student, that we want to make her as functional in the world as possible. We don't want her to feel embarrassed or awkward or something when she's in the world needing to read. And that was also the world 20 plus years ago, where technology wasn't quite the same and things like that. But in terms of, do we ever feel like good enough is enough? It's a hard question. And I think that it depends on a lot of things, including the student and the family's perspectives. And I think sometimes we have benchmarks, like maybe it's 100 words per minute. But I also think hearing what the student is feeling like and what their family is feeling like and what their goals are for the future are important to bring in. And that might not be the one thing that every student needs to achieve to feel successful and have functional literacy, especially with all of the accommodative tools that we have today.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, too, it doesn't mean that a student who has low RAN is never going to get there. It's going to mean that they're going to leverage their other potential strengths, like strengths in oral language, cognitive abilities, comprehension, all of these sorts of things, that they can get there. It's not a, you'll never make it to X criterion. It's a, this is going to be something that's going to make it a little bit harder for you to get there. So it's a really, it's such a good question, Melissa, of sort of what do we expect and when do we sort of say, you've gotten to where we think your capacities are most likely to have you land.
Right, especially because you could finish a curriculum and you could keep them forever. You could keep working on fluency. You could keep working on written expression. You know, there's a lot of things that you keep working on. You're thinking, okay, when do I cut this kid loose and say, we've done what we can do? I mean, I want to be fair to everybody. You know what I mean?
I wonder too, if looking at some of the data, hopefully that as going through that curriculum, we're looking at that student's gains and how much they're being able to extrapolate those skills to new text and things like that. And maybe if that particular approach or that curriculum has gotten them to a point where they're starting to plateau, it's okay, we try something new and take that approach.
One thing Melissa had said that made me think, in Texas, we have Texas dyslexia law, and it's in place in our public schools and in our charter schools. And a lot of our kids get identified, not all of them, but a lot of them get identified in elementary school. And then they move on to secondary, and maybe they're still receiving dyslexia services. Well, a lot of these kids miss when they get to secondary. They have to make a choice. Am I going to play football? Am I going to be in band? Am I going to be in art? Or I'm going to keep going to my dyslexia class? We have to find a happy medium for these kids. Yes, I want you to learn how to read and spell and write, but at the same time, I want you to be happy, and that I think would play into their mental health too. When you think about all of those types of things, it was just an off the chart thought I had, but it was something I had talked about with another person the other day.
You're totally right. I worked with a student last year who was a senior at Northwestern, and she was in School of Education and Social Policy. So that's our education arm. And she was dyslexic, and she wanted to do a qualitative study about other students at Northwestern and other highly ranked undergraduate universities about those students' experiences. And what you were saying about these trade-offs and how students have to figure out how things that are going to take them longer. When she interviewed a lot of her fellow students who identified as dyslexic, they often said things like, I know that it's going to take me 2.5 times as long as my peers to get the same reading done for this class. And I've known that for a long time. And so I've tried this quarter to not pick all of my courses to be super reading heavy courses and things like that. I think it was that the students both knew themselves and were strategic, and they also were extraordinarily motivated to make it happen. There were almost no cases where they said, well, I just gave up on this. It was that they were staying up the extra hours at night. They were working as hard as they could to advocate for all of the accommodations and resources that they needed to support them. Essentially, I got the sense from this beautiful qualitative study that she did that students really knew themselves and were not making those trade-offs as much for the ones that are at, top 10 rated university like Northwestern, but they were extraordinarily hardworking and were just making it all happen, which is not necessarily what I would have guessed to be the theme coming out of those results. I would have expected some of the trade-offs that you were mentioning.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be the same for everyone. I recognize students at Northwestern are not all the students.
And I almost feel like it's not fair. I mean, it's not fair for those kids to have to make that decision. It's not fair for their parents to have to make that decision. They want their child happy. They want what motivates that child to go to school. It may be their elective. It may be football. It may be dance. It may be whatever, it's probably not Miss Rodenroth's dyslexia therapy class, unless they really dug my class. That's the only
I
thing.
don't know. I mean, sometimes you're thinking about being a well-rounded student and what's your mental health, what helps you get up in the morning and be excited about what's going to happen in your
Right.
day. Maybe knowing somebody like you that makes them feel like they are working to the top of their ability and they're making progress and they are really investing in themselves might help, even though we also know reading instruction, especially in the later years, can feel like a slog. It can be tough and not that much fun at times. And it's not always going to be butterflies and rainbows. But I think also sometimes having someone that believes in you and is supporting you and is helping you be your best person can be something that, even when it's hard, can make a really big difference. But I think it's hard that this idea of that you might have to give up something that you want to be doing, that you maybe don't get to be in advanced band because you don't have the time in your schedule when you've got to balance all of these other things, is tough. And I think keeping that in mind with the mental health piece and making sure that students fill their cup, so to speak, with the things that they benefit from and enjoy and feel efficacious in is so important too. And so if we take all of that away, students are really going to have a harder time.
No, I'm glad you came back to the mental health piece, because that's one thing I was going to talk to you about. We talk about comorbidities quite a bit. And we talk about ADHD, and we talk about dyscalculia, we talk about dysgraphia, we talk, all the disses, speech, things like that. But I don't feel like we talk about the mental health piece that goes along with it enough. So what is some of your takeaways from dyslexia and mental health?
Great question. I think it's something that we've known, for example, and this has come up in the podcast before, that the co-occurrence, I try not to say comorbidity as much more.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to get away from it. It's just really hard.
And it's not a dig on you. It's just it's something that, as we're all trying to make our language meet with the way that we want it to, something that I'm always thinking about. So co-occurrence or comorbidity of dyslexia and ADHD, we have known for a long time that if the two things happened randomly in the genetic lottery, far fewer kids would have both.
Right.
And actually, when I was a teacher at Landmark, my student who is a senior who had both, when we said, what do you want to learn about? What do you want to write a scientific paper about? Anything. And she said, I want to know why so many kids have dyslexia and ADHD. And so I was like, gosh, cool, let's go. And so I had already been interested in that, but it was really cool to work with a student to dig in and research that. And we found earlier theories that had been debunked, like the idea of assortative mating, that folks who are dyslexic or ADHD were more likely to have kids with other folks who are dyslexic and or ADHD. That's not the best explanation for why this happens, but that was out there for a while as an idea.
Oh, I've not heard that before. More prone to, maybe because of a bonding experience?
Yeah, just that if somebody's ADHD and somebody's dyslexic, maybe they're more likely to be in a environment where jobs, things like that, where they might encounter each other, and maybe they have, who knows, whatever reason, the idea would be that folks who are ADHD, folks who are dyslexic have babies together, and those babies are going to bring a shared higher likelihood of dyslexia and ADHD. But that doesn't seem to be the case. There's still this high co-occurrence that we see. And there's a lot of work from twin studies that looked at this and things like that. And so it seems like there's something that is genetic, that before kids ever learn to read, before we could really even know if you're dyslexic, that there are higher rates of likelihood of having both ADHD and dyslexia. So I've been interested in this since back then, 20 plus years ago. So then ADHD is one type of mental health challenge, but there are also others. So there is depression and anxiety and all kinds of other things. And it seems like, and again, there's not a ton of research out there on this, that there is a higher likelihood of having anxiety or depression when you have dyslexia. What I'm really interested in knowing is whether there has always been a likelihood that a child is going to have what's called an internalizing disorder, like depression or anxiety, alongside dyslexia. Because it's very easy for all of us to imagine a student who starts struggling with reading, seeing that their peers are doing better than them in all of these things, maybe experiencing bullying, any of these things, the likelihood that someone might struggle with anxiety or depression is higher. But I'm really curious about whether there has also always been a higher chance of those things to be present in a person's life. And so we are looking at a lot of the data that we have from previous studies on this now, and also collecting new data to try to look at these, because it's very hard to statistically determine causation.
Oh.
We always say, right, correlation does not, equal causation. And so it takes a lot. We obviously can't wave our magic wands and say, hey, you who are about to get anxiety, boop, not anymore. We're going to turn that off for you. We don't have the capacity to do things like that, to do sort of randomized intervention in that way. So it's hard statistically to do it, but I think it's so important. And so I'm taking opportunities to look across different studies of kids who are assessed at different time points and different ages and things like that, to try to get at this question, because I think if we could have strong evidence that kids, say in kindergarten, who look like they're likely to have dyslexia might also be at higher risk already, even before they learn to read, of anxiety and depression, it might help their families, their pediatricians, their schools help keep an eye on those things and give support in those areas as well as needed, and not sort of just say, oh, school is hard and so they're not feeling that happy these days, or things like that. Or, yeah, I can see why they don't want to read out in front of the classroom, because, they're a little bit anxious about that because they're not that good at reading. But maybe having a better understanding of that would help have support for their mental health as well.
And now a word from our sponsor.
Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Aimee.
So let's talk about who we met at IDA, Tumbleweed.
Oh, I love Tumbleweed's decodable books, and they're for striving readers in grades 2 through 6. My favorite thing about them, in addition to the storylines, is the inclusion of comprehension, spelling, and vocabulary activities.
Yes, and there's no guessing because they took out the visual distractions. They still have illustrations, but not right next to the print.
And Tumbleweed is easy to implement with any core or intervention program. Their teacher guides are jam-packed with multimodal approaches.
Check them out at tumbleweedpublishing.com. Hi, this is Aimee Rodenroth, and as part of the Dyslexia Duo podcast team and owner of Discovery Dyslexia Services, I want to talk to you about my business. Our COUT-trained team offers expert virtual or in-person therapy located in Prosper, Texas, using proven dyslexia curricula like Take Flight, Build, MTA, Alphabetic Phonics, and Reading by Design. We also provide crucial independent evaluations and advocacy services. Don't wait. Empower your child today. Visit www.discovereed.com to learn more. That again is www.discovereed.com. Discovereed, covering all your dyslexia needs. Let's return to the show.
I wonder about little micro triggers too. Micro triggers of things that are negative and what that does for the body's cortisol response, how the amygdala responds to that as well. Like, does it automatically shut something down to make somebody feel more comfortable? And in turn, then those, just even early on when you're a preschooler and kids around you are learning letters and sounds. And if that's not something you can interpret without even knowing, that their brain internalizes the difference and responds.
I think it's such a good question. It's so hard to study these kinds of things, especially those things that happen in real life. We've been trying, and maybe we could talk about it a little bit later in my lab, to look at what the brain is doing in more naturalistic sorts of ways. So rather than us lying in an MRI and staring at a screen,
Right.
it's so hard to know exactly those kinds of things that you're talking about, Melissa. And so even with the advent in much more in adults of doing things like what's called ecological momentary assessment, for example, where we have somebody wear an Apple Watch and we see that their heart rate goes up a little bit and we say, hey, you good? What's going on? Obviously a lot trickier to do in a 3 or a 4-year-old. Probably not
right.
feasible at this point. But it's such a good question. I think it's going to be one of these things that we sit with for a long time in science, because it is so hard to get to knowing what's going on in those situations behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I guess that leads me to my next question about when kids are born, either premature, lack of oxygen, if they have had, say, for example, an instance where they got medication they shouldn't have ingested and developed what seems like dyslexia later. This actually happened to one of my students way back when the mom was worried about that maybe that caused dyslexia. Do you know about those types of things as being a real causation, or what are your thoughts on that?
Good question. The case of medication ingested is probably a pretty rare one, and I might kind of put that in a little bit of a different category for us to think about. I think what we know, in part from the genetic studies about the genes that we know all are little bitty pieces of what form the greater picture of dyslexia. There's not one gene. There are probably a lot of genes that are each interplaying in important ways and making small contributions. What we know about what a lot of those genes do is that they affect the way that the brain is being set up before the child is ever born. So they're affecting how neurons move around in the brain and get to the right place and connect with each other and things like that. And so premature birth is a really interesting and important one. We know that kids born very premature, and I think the cutoff for this is around 30 weeks, so about 10 weeks premature, have much, much higher rates of language problems than kids born full term. I'm not sure what the figure is for dyslexia, but given all of the things we know, I think that's also a pretty likely thing to imagine. And so I think with these things like prematurity, which is so common, it's not a rare thing, even injury in utero or during birth or things like that are also not super rare, but do happen. I think any of these things that are setting up the way that the brain is connected, that's going to make reading easier or harder, are going to be relevant. It is, I think, a little bit trickier to know about things that happen as kids are, out in the world, not still in the womb, and things like that happen. There are pretty amazing cases of brain plasticity. So, for example, where a young child has a brain injury and a big part of their brain needs to be removed, or it's never been there, they can look really quite typical. It's so different than when we're older in life and we have a stroke and a part of our brain is damaged and we suddenly lose important abilities. That's why that plasticity piece is so important for identifying and intervening as early as possible. But there are these things that are going to affect the way that our brain is developing for learning to read, that I think most of them probably do happen very early in life before any parent has any opportunity to make any difference. I think that's really important too, for parents to not feel like they did something wrong, whether it's that they didn't do X thing during pregnancy or didn't put the Mozart headphones on the pregnant belly or something like that, or do something like read enough books every night. We know there's this big genetic piece. And so I think that there are things that are affecting how the brain gets set up that's going to make reading easier or harder. And a lot of them have to happen very early in life, but I really want to emphasize that I can't think of a case where I would say to a parent, well, yeah, if you could go back, you should have done that differently.
Talking about in utero and PA, I do a lot of teaching, and one of my teachers that I was training stood up to do a training, and her lesson was on phonological awareness. She said that phonological awareness can start in utero at 23 weeks. Is that true? Because I go, what? I
Well,
go,
so
are they tapping out? Act, you know.
the hearing system develops very early and is one of the only systems that's really adult-like when we're born. So not a lot of people know our vision is pretty crummy as soon as we're born. It's almost like when we're old, things up close are kind of blurry. And interestingly, the optimal distance for seeing when you're a newborn is about the distance for if your caregiver is cradling you in their arms, that about 12 to 18 inches is sort of where you see best. So infants are not great at seeing, but their hearing is basically as good as ours, if not better, as we start aging. So one of the things that this makes me think about is one of my favorite studies. And in this study, they used a modified type of MEG, magnetoencephalography, which picks up the tiny magnetic changes in the brain as neurons fire. And we can do this in adults by putting sort of like if you think of a salon hair dryer helmet kind of a thing around our head, and with little detectors that are super, super sensitive and can pick up the magnetic changes in our brain. One study that I know of did this where they created a special version that people put their pregnant belly into, and it was detecting the changes in the brain of the baby in utero. Super cool. I always wish that I could have one of these in my lab. And what they did was this very simple passive listening task that we do in my lab and a lot of other studies called a mismatch negativity task. And in that, you play one sound over and over and over, and every once in a while you play a different sound. So you can do it with tones, like it's the same tone, and then all of a sudden it's a higher pitch or a longer length. We do it with syllables. So we play ba, 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 da, ba, ba. And our brains, even when we're not paying any attention, even when we're in utero, even when we're asleep, are so tuned to detecting those auditory changes that there's a difference in how the brain responds to the common or standard sound versus that oddball or deviant sound. And so the babies in utero, knowing that the sound has to get all the way through and it's going to be kind of muffled and everything, just playing it in speakers outside, the babies' brains who weren't even born yet show a difference between the ba sound and the da sound. And if you think of that, you can call that phonological awareness, right? It's detecting.
I was wondering, I'm like, how in the world, because she's not tapping out sound. I thought maybe it had to do with word boundaries.
I think it's, well, that's an interesting one too. And I always think of phonological awareness as explicit ability to manipulate and understand sounds. And so it's almost getting to that meta knowledge. And obviously the fetus does not have meta knowledge of phonology.
Right.
But let's say there might be phonological processing differences. And I'm not sure exactly on the age, if it's 23 weeks per se, but it's for sure well before birth. We also know there are these beautiful studies where kids are tested hours after birth and they're played a language that's similar to the one they were exposed to in utero versus rhythmically really different. And they have differences to their brain responses to those. So the brain is taking in information in utero for sure that relates to language. And I guess you could argue that it's the earliest foundations of building phonological processing and information, but I wouldn't say you're doomed if you didn't get a good 23-week phonological awareness score.
That's so funny. Yeah, because I'm typing and I'm listening to her lecture, but I'm typing up my critique, and she said that it was like, that was my oddball deviant sound. I go, what? What? What is this? So, and then I was like, how that my brain just kind of stopped what I was doing. Like, how do you do that in utero? How is that taught? How is that measured? What did they do? That's what I kind of went off on the tangent. Thank you for clearing that up. That really helps.
When we have those neuroscience tools where we can ask babies in utero what they know about the sounds of language, then I think we'll really know a lot more about language and reading and dyslexia.
Awesome.
That's so cool. That's so cool.
Awesome.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about way earlier. How do you feel like educators should respond when there is a at-risk flag for dyslexia?
Good question. So I think at-risk and screening, the whole idea of screening for anything, if any of us go in for a screening for any condition, I think of screening as meaning we need a follow-up to get more information. Screening is not the same as diagnosis. And so I think making sure that the assessment for screening was valid and solid. It wasn't the day that the kid cut ear tubes the day before or something like that. We're going to make sure we've got good screening data. Then I think it needs to be a follow-up that kind of corroborates, frames, tries to differentially identify what's going on. And that can be so tricky. And I've heard you both talk about this before with kind of what can families do when they have this, what do they say next to their school and things like that. It's really tricky to do. The ideal thing is that they get a really comprehensive, thoughtful eval that really helps kind of tease apart what's going on. And if it's something like a really focused phonological awareness difficulty, get them right into one of the effective programs that we know, and as much as possible within reason to get them on track. And if it's multiple challenges, phonological weakness and RAN and language comprehension, then we've got to figure out also what makes sense as the foundation and what comes on later, and what are we going to work around. You're not going to try to make their RAN better necessarily, but maybe it's that supporting their spoken language is going to let them have more language interactions that are going to bolster their intrinsic phonological representations, and that's going to help them with their phonological awareness or things like that. These are the things we don't know. I think we're all making our best educated guesses at, but I think the number one thing when you've got a flag after screening is make sure it was a good screening, and then an eval that should really complement that screening comes next.
Excellent. Excellent. So kind of thinking about all the research you've done in the history of you, you can go back to high school if you want. What is something about all of your research that has really surprised you?
I think the thing that's really surprised me is when I was starting grad school, I had just been a teacher. I was so invigorated by this idea of let's go put them out of business. Let's find a way to identify kids early. This was in the early 2000s. Whole genome sequencing for people was becoming possible. The new president of Tufts, where I was going to grad school, was a geneticist who studied autism and dyslexia, among other things. I was going to work with Marianne Wolf, and we were collaborating with Don Gabrielli at MIT, and we were going to start doing some fMRI studies of kids to look at the earliest precursors of reading. If you had asked me the year I started grad school, I would have said, we're going to have dyslexia solved in 5 to 7 years. We're maybe going to stick one of our neuroscience tools in what used to be like a custodial closet in every school, and it's going to save them so much money, because even if they've got to invest in whatever we figure out is the way to identify kids, if we can give them earlier intervention, it'll save them so much money and so much frustration for those kids in the long term. I really thought that with the improvements in neuroscience and the improvements in genetics, this was going to be something we were going to figure out rapidly. And that might have been the hubris of a brand new graduate student, but there really were big changes in technology around those times that I really thought were going to make this much clearer. And so I think the thing that has surprised me most is what we see when we study group A of, say, typical range readers and group B of readers who are below the typical range, is that the differences within each group are substantial, and there's even overlap in, say, the genetic and the brain profiles between those two groups. And the picture is so much more complex than I would have thought 20 plus years ago in that stage.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
It's kind of overwhelming. And I feel like there would be so much that we could do differently. And I feel like we're all scurrying about trying to solve this problem. And I think that there is no real solve unless everybody's all in on the same page. And I think that's kind of where we are right now. We don't
I think
really
you're
have
so right. And with the fact that genetics and brain imaging has not given us the magic wand where we know what to do, the sorting hat, if you will, of which kids are going to need what, I think it has shown me for sure, and I think a lot of other researchers, that partnerships with teachers and with intervention and understanding what intervention does, and with families and tracking kids and developing in research strong enough relationships with families and kids that we can see them back in the lab over time, because those data are so important to understanding reading. I think it has shifted. I really thought like, oh, we'll just say to schools, here's exactly what you do. Like we'll swoop in and we'll tell them. And that is not it at all. It's that the partnerships are so fundamental now to us being able to figure out all together, basically, what's going to work and what we should do.
I saw a quote recently that said something to the effect of, you can tell how good a school's intervention is for struggling readers by how many reading centers there are with a waiting list. And it struck a chord for me because I'm not really trying to be braggadocious at all, but I do have a waiting list. I have 3 people working with me, and we have people constantly contacting us wanting services. And I think this is a big red flag for what's going on in the schools. And I'm not trying to place all the blame on schools, but I think the schools need to really be listening to the research and trying to implement what you guys as researchers are saying, and the policymakers need to be, listening to the researchers as well. And then us as the people that are providing the services could be sharing the data and, really proving to them, this is what we can see.
No school district wants to have a lot of struggling readers. Everybody wants all the kids to read extremely well and have that work out. And I think one of the things that I wish, if I could get one message out there to schools, is rather than waiting to see what happens and see if this kid who, flagged as at risk, for example, resolves on their own, you're going to spend less money and resources in investing early and potentially getting some of those kids on track. Or they might need kind of just a booster in terms of, their phonological awareness or decoding or things like that to get on track. My other student, when I was at Landmark, had been in public school up to 8th grade, was reading at about a 3rd or a 4th grade level, struggling, felt really bad about himself because of it, all of that. Got to Landmark, got a high quality structured multisensory intervention program, and decoding clicked in. And the next year in 10th grade, I was his tutorial teacher, and we had 45 minutes together each day. And he was really lacking in background knowledge because he hadn't read almost anything up to 8th grade. But what was he able to read and understand? And again, thinking about my other student, what do you want to study? The overlap between dyslexia and ADHD. Said to him, what do you want to read? His is the Da Vinci Code. Great. Whatever you're motivated for, my friend, here we go. I'm going to go buy my paperback of the Da Vinci Code and we're going to read it. And he could read it after a year before being at a 3rd or 4th grade reading level, because that clicked in for him. And for all of that struggle that he had, all of the, I'm sure, unending advocacy that his family had to do for him to get him to be at a school like Landmark, I wonder so often if somebody had said, hey, get this kiddo some high quality structured multisensory phonological intervention in 1st grade, I think he might have had a really different pathway. And so I wish schools would realize that this is not like a wait and see, and it probably will get better, because I think that's rarely the case. I think that if everybody realized, and the schools are only concerned with resources because it's hard to be a school, nobody has infinite budgets. The best thing I think you could do would be identify kids early and give them high quality, evidence-based intervention.
Yeah.
It seems to me paradoxical that isn't happening.
Nice.
I agree.
So knowing all that knowing the good and the not so good, what keeps you hopeful in this area?
What keeps me hopeful is I continue to see a new generation of researchers who are interested in these same questions, who are getting explicit training in things that my generation never did, like community engaged research and like implementation science, that were just not even ideas that were floated. I mean, maybe even 10 years ago, that the idea that you would, for example, if you want to know what teachers can do to support students who flag on screening, go talk to the teachers and have them help you design the research questions and have them give input during the research process and help you interpret the results as they come in and things like that. That was pretty foreign when I was coming up. And then the whole science of implementation of, if I have an intervention that I think works, how do I really study? What are the barriers? What are the things that are going to make teachers excited about it and allow them to implement it well? And things like that, that are changing in the field that I think are going to, like we said, I realize for sure that neuroscience and genetics are not going to do it on their own.
Right.
And so to make those partnerships, I think is going to be really important. And to have the PhD students that are in my lab and that I get to engage with all the time across the country, they are thinking about these questions, thinking about them in a practical way, and getting these types of training that previous generations did not, that I think are going to change potentially the way things are going. Because I'll say, for me, I keep kind of wondering, in the way that fMRI changed cognitive neuroscience research, I'm kind of waiting for the next thing, because so far, the tools that we have right now, I think even putting them in the very smartest people's hands, haven't given us all of the answers of things that we want to know that I think should be tractable, answerable questions. And so I'm wondering when, and I don't know what this will be, if there's not something on the horizon that's just sort of looming, but I wonder what the next tool we will have to look at the brain that can give us information in a new way, because I think so far what we've tried hasn't illuminated what's really going on when somebody is struggling with reading.
Yeah, I wonder what's out there. I wonder what's the next thing. I can remember, I don't know how many years ago, I've been doing this since 92, that somebody had said, oh, all you need is fMRIs in all the schools. I'm like, well, yeah, okay, that's going to happen. Whatever, but what is going to be the next thing to help support our students with at least identification? We know what works for remediation, but what's going to help in the field of identification?
I'll say, I mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the things, and I don't think this will be the fix and the end all be all, but one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is when we study the brain, we do it in really unnatural contexts. Rarely are we looking at kids' brains when they're in the classroom, when they're doing intervention, when they're reading. We're sticking them in a small tube with loud noise and telling them to not move an inch.
Right.
And that's not much like how we teach reading and how they learn language and reading. So we've been trying some stuff in my lab for a while now, especially focusing on younger kids, because now I'm also really interested in what could we do to even identify in toddlerhood and before, so that we could start building up language skills or things like that. Not to pathologize or over-identify or say parents are doing anything wrong, but say like, hey, your kid was a little bit late to talk, and that's also making us concerned that maybe reading might be a little bit trickier for them. So here's what you can do to, just in your everyday routines, which you've talked about before, to support their language so that they're going to be in the best place they can be when they show up to kindergarten. So we've been doing EEG, so recording the natural electrical signals of the brain, where we normally would just put a cap on somebody and have them sit in a comfortable chair and look at things on a screen. So we could, for example, flash different letters or play different sounds, like I mentioned, where we play the ba's and da's. What we've been doing instead is giving a parent and a kid sitting at a table together books and puzzles and putting an EEG cap on both of them and letting them hang out and play.
Interesting.
And so what we're looking at instead is kind of what are the moments where the child might have opportunities to be learning from their caregiver? When is the caregiver pointing out maybe a new word in the book? And so it's not just that one moment, but it's sort of any of the times when the caregiver is really sharing the book in an interactive way. And we are looking at the kid's brain and whether that might be sort of following what the caregiver is sharing with them at that moment. So I don't think this is going to be the fix for everything, but also for some other conditions like autism, where these social interactions are really central to kids' development. Maybe that's different. And so we're looking at some of those things. And then I want to share with you one other study that I'm really excited about coming down the pike.
Sure.
We at Northwestern are part of a national study funded by NIH called the Healthy Brain and Child Development Study, HBCD. And so for many years, going back over a decade, NIH had a study starting at age 10, following students up to age 20, called ABCD, Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development. And then I always sort of joke that NIH realizes that fun and interesting stuff happens in the brain before kids are 10. That's, of course, not the case. They knew this the whole time, but they have gotten many of the different institutes all across NIH. So Child Health and Human Development. A big interest is from National Institute on Drug Abuse to look at development in kids who had substance use early in utero, things like that. All of these different NIH institutes interested in different things about development. And we have 27 sites around the country in the US who are all working together, and we are enrolling families when the baby is in the second trimester of pregnancy. So well before kids can learn to read, and studying so many different things about their development. And reading, of course, is something that I'm very interested in, and a couple of other major researchers in the reading world, like my colleague Lori Cutting at Vanderbilt University, is part of the study. But all of us do the same set of measures in the same way with all of these kids. And we're going to have well over 5,000 kids that we study from before they're born up until they're age 10.
Wow.
And so we're doing these measures I mentioned, the mismatch negativity, this ba, 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 da task. We're doing that on those kids when they're as young as 3 months. We are looking at their language. We are looking at their everything, genetics, motor development, all of these things that are not even things that I think about ever in my research. But also this data, importantly, will be available to the scientific community. And so anybody who is at accredited institution and gets approval to say that they're going to use these data in an approved and ethical way can get access to all of this information. And so right now the oldest kid is 3, so we've got a ways to go until they grow up, but we're already planning the measures that we want to get about reading. And I am so interested to see on this big scale. It's so amazing and rare for us to get the chance to study kids on the scale of thousands with this degree of information. And we get MRIs and EEGs on them almost every year, or more often we get an MRI in their first 4 weeks of life.
Wow.
Which is so exciting.
Incredible.
And so this will be a resource for the whole scientific community to have and use it. The data are already available to other scientists who have the right ethical approvals to use them. And I am so excited for the field to see what this can tell us about looking at all of these different types of information that we hadn't even thought of before. Like one of them, for example, is the amount of noise in your neighborhood. What is that going to do as your brain is developing and kind of processing sound or things like that? So I wanted to share that because I'm so excited about this. It's such a unique opportunity, and also how important it is that NIH continues to fund work like this, that, you know, no one lab could ever do anything like this, to have so many kids and families. And so helping your audience as well to realize that scientific funding and advocating for that is so important for us to have these insights.
Absolutely.
So I made a connection. Well, I've made many connections with what you've said, but I can remember when I was pregnant with my first child, and he was, you know, he's 27 now. But our house was always noisy with dogs. It's still noisy with dogs in the other room. Dogs are always barking. And my mom used to tell me, she goes, you're going to have to get those dogs under control, because when he's here, he's going to wake up by the noise of the dog. He would wake up if the dogs weren't making noise, because that's what he was used to hearing all his life. That was, I guess, his white noise for him. But he heard it in utero. Anyway, it relates but doesn't relate. But it made me kind of think of that, those external factors, what happens when you're pregnant and all of that. So I don't know if it relates or not, but it made me think about that.
Yeah, and we never knew if he was a kid that didn't have dogs around anyway, if he might have been the same way and just extra quiet was something that made him, attend. So it'll be so neat. I think this is what's the thing that for me about so exciting about having such a huge group of kids compared to what any of us. So many of these studies of fMRI of reading are 10 kids, 14 kids, 17 kids. To have this opportunity on such a big scale, I think will help us get insights about these things that many of us have always sort of wondered of like,
Yeah.
I noticed this pattern. Is this true for other kids? We'll have so much more power to know with such a big sample.
So will that also include any kind of behavior patterns? Will you guys be observing that? Any development of ADHD, maybe trauma-informed behaviors, things like that?
We sure will. And at Northwestern, my colleagues have been leading the country, especially in looking at some of the ways to assess early regulation that underlies ADHD and other things. And we also just were developing, my colleagues at Northwestern, the way that we're going to be asking caregivers to tell us more about the mental health of the kids starting when they're around 4 or 5. And we said to the rest of the researchers in the consortium all around the country, hundreds of them, which is exciting and also challenging. Hey, here's what we're planning to look at. And one of the things that one of our colleagues said is you really need to make sure that you're looking at effects of trauma in these particular ways. And especially because we know that a lot of these kids in our study will go through transitions in care. They might go to foster care. They might have a different person in their family who becomes their caregiver and things like that. We want to know about that. So we are going to have really rich information about that. And so back to the information about mental health and reading, it is going to be an unbelievable opportunity to be able to learn more about those things.
That's incredible. I'm excited to hear about that.
Thank you.
So if we have listeners that want to find you, read some more about what you're doing, where can they find you?
If people want to find me, our lab's website is learnlab, learnlab.northwestern.edu. And you can find more information if you're interested in that study I mentioned nationally, the HBCD study at hbcdstudy.org.
Okay, very
Excellent.
nice. I feel like we all need to kind of read up on all this.
Yes, that's exciting. Okay, so we're going to do a lightning round set of questions. So we're just going to ask you a question or two, and we just want like 1 or 2 word response. Just get that like quick thinking. All righty. So let's get going. At what age should kids be screened?
4 or 5.
Dyslexia. Okay, 4 or 5. Great.
Okay, interesting. In your opinion, what's the biggest myth about dyslexia?
Oh, I could go on for ages. The idea that words jump around on pages and letters are backwards and it's all a visual problem that is so pervasive is just puzzling to me that it's still so widespread.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's one early red flag parents should look for?
This is a very good question. I think early on, parents can pay attention to language. And we know kids are going to make mistakes as they're learning to talk. They're going to say things like, I go to the store. But if you notice compared to your child's peers or to maybe older siblings or things like that, that their language development is not on track and their grammar and things like that are not looking like other kids you would compare them to, then I would say get them an evaluation for language because that's going to follow up to reading. It's just harder to know for things like RAN and phonemic awareness much before we're able to test them when they're, again, 4 or 5, hence the screening age that I mentioned.
Yeah. Okay, a book you recommend, and it doesn't have to be about research, but it could, a book you recommend to everyone.
Oh, gosh. I wish I had this question in advance. Okay, I'm going to give a non-research book.
Okay.
One of my very favorite books is My Life in France by Julia Child, because what I love about Julia Child is she didn't start cooking until she was in her 40s.
Yeah.
And she found her path and she figured out what was right for her and how she could share what she had with the world so much later than so many of us think might be possible. And that really kind of resonates with me of like, we might not be on the right stretch for a while, but you can still get there. And it's a beautiful book.
I haven't read it, but I've heard about it. I haven't read it. I would love to.
Okay, so what gives you hope right now?
There is an amazing next generation of scientists coming along who I think as we continue to partner and continue to get more technology, that things are going to keep getting better.
Love it.
All right, one more. And then we've monopolized you enough, I think.
Okay.
One thing people would be surprised to know about you. Ooh.
One thing people would be surprised to know about me is I can say the alphabet backwards and name all the states in order forwards and backwards.
Oh my gosh. Okay,
What?
so now you have to demonstrate.
You want the alphabet?
Yes.
ZYXWVUT SRQPON MLKJIHGFEDCBA.
Very that was very good. Is that a little kid thing that you did?
Yes, and back to my sewing interest, my mom had a sampler of the ABCs on my wall when I was growing up. And just one day I said, I'm going to learn them backwards. And she's like, okay. And we made little mnemonics and everything. It was kind of a nice little teaching moment for my mom, the early childhood educator. And I've been able to do that since I was a kid.
Wow.
Okay, let's hear the states forwards and backwards. We might be here a while, huh?
Oh my gosh, I'm going to spare your poor listeners, Aimee.
I remember being a little kid and just being bored because it's before computers and all that, being bored, so bored one summer that I memorized Jabberwocky.
Very cool.
It was like,
I love stuff like that. Yeah, I will not bore you with the states, but true story, I wouldn't lead you astray anymore.
I love that. Well, this has been so wonderful.
Yes.
And thank you so much for donating so much of your time to our podcast and for our listeners. We really appreciate you.
Thank you both for everything that you're doing. And say thank you out there to all of the teachers and the families listening for all of the things that you're doing that I think you rarely get thanked for. So I'm appreciative for everybody. And thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It was fun.
So much. This is Aimee.
And Melissa.
And we're the Dyslexia
Dyslexia Duo.
Until next time.
Bye.
Bye.
The Dyslexia Duo hosts are Melissa Dean
and Aimee Rodenroth. The producer is Greg Rodenroth.
Dyslexia awareness is so important. Please share with your friends, family, and anyone who needs to know more about dyslexia.
Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X at the Dyslexia Duo.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.